Well, first of all, I got to disqualify myself because I had a bet with some buddies, and I said the Russians wouldn't invade. And my argument was if they did within 2 weeks, they'd be in the situation that they're in. But common sense did not prevail, and they invaded. And they're exactly in the quagmire that they did not want to be.
What do you see in 6 months from now?
A very good chance the Ukrainians will have taken the land bridge, broken it at the very minimum, taken all of Kherson, taken all of the land along the Black Sea that faces Crimea. Very good chance they have taken Crimea also. However, I don't think before could be they're planning for an invasion, not invasion, but a counter attack into the Luhansk and Donbass area in 6 months, and they're trying to push the last of the Russians out of their territory. I could see that be very likely. If it has not happened, there's probably a good chance that Putin's still in charge. Because if Putin's not in charge, I don't see any reason why any Russian soldier would stay in the Donbass. They would just turn around and go home.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Homeland Security Off the Record. My guest is Pat McGlynn. He is a retired U.S. Army major, an intelligence officer, I guess, on the ground. And what you think is going to happen next as we start approaching winter?
Well, Russia's praying for General Winter to show up, bottom line. They think it's going to change their situations. It won't. But it does make it easier for whoever's on the defense. Winter always makes it easier for those that are on the defense because you don't take as much logistics, as much ammunition, as much anything because you're sitting still. You don't need the fuel. You do need fuel, but you don't need as much as when you're in a maneuver situation. So right now, the Russians are hoping that Winter will make their cards be a little bit better than they've been dealt so far. Okay. Ukraine is not looking for something to save them. What they're looking for is they're hungry. They have the initiative. They've had the initiative ever since Russia stopped its incremental advance in the Donbass. Mm-hmm. They were getting small gains, okay, and they were basically using thermobaric rockets to plaster the front lines of the Ukrainian defenders and then use their minimal trained forces to go forward and occupy those partially or fully obliterated lines. And then they would send their rocket launchers to the rear. They would reload them up, and it would all happen again in the next day. And it was moving forward by, yards, thousands of yards. It was slow. It was bloody. And it was very, very, ammunition intensive because they could not take anything without first doing a barrage across it. And it wasn't a minimal barrage. It was a fairly hefty barrage because you can't just do it in one place and keep moving forward in one spot. You have to do it across the front or otherwise you open up your flanks. as you move forward. So that's the way they were doing it. It was working. It was slow. It was painstaking, but it was working. When that stopped, that was when Russia lost the initiative, because at that point, there was a quote ceasefire along the front, and during those few weeks that went by, you saw both sides quote licking their wounds, but in reality, all along this time, Ukraine was fighting a slow attrition for dirt situation. They would lose bodies unwillingly, but they wouldn't give up any turf without a hard fight. They were doing their very best to bleed the Russian forces white. And at the same time, they had their A team, not their second string or whatever. They had their A team back in the rear in NATO, being trained by U.S. forces, being trained by NATO forces. They were wargaming it. They were looking at what they had, what they could do. They had a excellent picture of the battlefield and the logistic situation of the Russians to guide those decisions. And right now, the final punch hasn't been thrown yet. The final punch will come in the Zaporizhzhia area, and it'll break all the way to the Black Sea. That will break the land bridge. That is the tactical jewel that the Ukrainians are going for. Without that, all they've really done is move some game pieces on the chessboard. By taking all the way and breaking that land bridge, and they've already cut the Kerch Bridge, now the entire Crimea area is now untenable. Just like the far side of the river in Kherson is untenable. They've had small footbridges that they put up. They're ferrying some stuff across in barges and things, but they have stopped trying to put stuff onto the east side of the, I'm going to mispronounce it, the Dnieper River. They're now attriting. They're egressing from the area. They're reducing their forces. They're leaving skeleton defense elements in forward. They're fighting rear guard actions. They're about to, if Kherson, the Kherson Oblast isn't in the hands of the Ukrainians in a week, I would be very surprised.
At the progress that they're making and the attrition levels on the Russian side, and so many giving up and just refusing to fight, Russia's just running out of capabilities.
Well, you got to remember, Ukraine is not set up to do thunder runs like the United States Army is. They kind of did one in the Kharkov region, but only because the enemy was completely routed, okay? And even then, they had to stop, readjust their lines. They have the problem in the east of every time they take territory along the Russian border, they have to man that border, or they're going to leave an opening for people to come in around in their rear. So they have to stop. Every time they find a cache of weapons, they have to move the cache, because the enemy knows where that cache is. Otherwise, the longer they leave it there, the longer they leave it open to artillery fire. So they have all kinds of chores they pick up as they move along, including rendering aid to their own citizens as they come across them. And so every person you find, you have to feed. Every person you find that's injured, you have to tend to. Every piece of turf that you take, you have to defend. So that's constantly reducing the number of forces they have at their pointy end of the sword. So that sword can't be thrown too far. So that's why they've basically had to stop. They've slowed down. They've realigned. They've gotten into position. They've armed, they've fueled, and they're gone back to taking tactical chunks to doing the very best they can to cut off lines of communication that are coming from Russia down into that region. And every time they cut off another line of communication from that region, they limit everybody to the west of that position of having resources and logistics. Now, they're getting the whole idea in the first place was to stretch the limited number of forces that the Russians had. And by faking the full-blown attack and not really taking very much, just doing probing attacks up and down the Kherson sector, forced, and all the hoopla, including Zelensky, every time he turned around saying there would be an offensive in the summer, the Russians took the bait and they shifted their forces into the Kherson Oblast. Consequently, they put them on the far side of an easily cut supply line with those bridges across the river. So that's what you ended up with. You had a very large section of the blooded and semi-trained military force of the Russian army, all on that one isolated oblast, and with a river to their back. And once they started using the HIMARS to cut those bridges at their leisure, it kept those guys from reinforcing any other attack, and that's when they attacked in the Kharkov region. Mm-hmm. So, but the real attack hasn't come yet, and the attack in Kharkov did not use all of Ukraine's reserves. They still have a hefty reserve force in the center section, waiting to do a heavy attack in the center of the line and break all the way down to probably Mariupol and liberate that. And because it would be good to take that, not just break the bridge, the land supply bridge from to Crimea from Russia, but by taking Mariupol, you'll also take a large industrial area and a port city.
Strategic port, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an extra cherry on the top of the sundae there if they can get that also. But they'll have to take some turf to the east of that to keep it from being shelled all the time. But that said, that is the strategic end to Ukraine I would see that they would want to do in the next few weeks before winter set in.
My name is Robert Kaiser. I'm the CEO of PPSS Group, and I absolutely trust the next generation of our high-performance body armor. And so can you.
Once winter sets in, it's going to be a dead period till the rains and the mushiness stops and it gets cold enough that you can move out and on the land across, and you can get off the roads themselves. Because if you're having an attack just down the roads, it's so easy to stop that. All you have to do is register your artillery positions on, a couple of strategic intersections, and you can keep people off that road indefinitely as long as you have rounds. So I don't think that's something that the Ukrainians would take that bait. So that's where I see the war going in the next few months. It's not going to be ended on the battlefield. It's going to be ended in Moscow. That's the only way this war is going to stop. Either Putin is deposed, there's a coup, he's removed from office by some other means, he retires, becomes incapacitated. I don't know. Okay, but right now, the only thing that's keeping the war going and is Putin's desire to keep Russian troops inside Ukraine's sovereign territory.
What do you think? I have my own feelings about whether Putin's bluffing on using low yield tactical nuclear weapons.
He's a risk taker. He would take risk. That's why he's in Ukraine in the first place. That's why he attacked Georgia before. That's why he attacked Ukraine itself back in 2014. That's why he took Chechnya, why he blew up apartments in Moscow and blamed it on the Chechens, so because he could whip up the flames of war. So he's a risk taker. Okay?
And like you said, in Chechnya, he just leveled Grozny. I mean, he just bombarded the place. He's done that everywhere.
But that's not just Putin. That's the Russian way of war. Unlike the Western, the West in World War II, even the Allies were not adverse to firebombing cities, of civilians. So we can't say America or the Allies necessarily had, high moral ground. But since World War II, it has been the policy of NATO and Western nations to go to great lengths to avoid civilian casualties. That aspect of war has not matured in the Russian doctrine equivalent.
Exactly. When he retaliated against Ukraine taking out the Kerch Bridge, he made a statement saying that he ordered civilian targets to be shelled, to be hit.
And he said it was in response to the terrorist action on the Kerch Bridge.
Right.
Right now, now that we're on the Kerch Bridge for a second, let's talk about that. That's not just a bridge, okay, and it's not just a because from what I understand, 2 lanes are still available on the highway side, but that bridge is actually 3 bridges. It's one way of 2 lanes of highway going into Crimea and 2 lanes going back separately with a separated lanes going back into Russia, and it's got a railroad bridge.
The railroad, that hasn't been repaired, and it's going to be a while before it is.
It's going to be at least a few weeks, they say, before it's repaired. But that may be pie in the sky hope. Okay, and I'll get into some of that. Back in the old days when we didn't do reconnaissance by drone, you had scout units that went out and you looked at bridges and you had to do assessments on them and draw pictures of them, and you had a notebook that you brought back, and it took a half an hour to translate it to the intel guys because it was all your hen scratch done with the red light underneath a blanket in the field somewhere.
Yeah, preparation of the battlefield.
Pretty much. Now, that was a big concrete bridge, and when they blew that truck up, that truck bomb, they blew it up on the lane that was close to, what they did is they chose to do it when the a fuel train was coming across it. They picked the time. I don't think that's coincidence. All right.
No,
they picked a time.
I don't either.
And they blew it up, and it lit the fuel train on fire. So all the damage that was done to the railroad bridge was not done by the bomb. It was done by the leaking fuel that came out of those busted trail cars, fuel cars that were burning. Okay. The worst possible thing that could have happened was that train conductor stopped, and he stopped because he didn't know what was happening. But by the time he had stopped and the burning had happened, he couldn't move anymore because then the rails were now distorted. Okay. We're not just replacing rails there. That fire burned at thousands of degrees for hours. So that concrete has been severely scorched. That means it's been embrittled. Okay. The next problem you have is that there's heavy multiple layers of reinforced rebar inside of it. That rebar has either been melted or thinned or actually broken in multiple places inside that embrittled concrete. If all they do is replace the railroad ties and the rails on the top and hope the stanchions to the left and the right on that bridge will support the weight all on those rails, then they've got greater faith than I do. Okay.
And that reminds me, there at the time that bridge, while it was being built, I've read two studies that came out of Russia.
It was built too fast and too shoddily.
They found structural defects, cracks, stress cracks, bolts that had just popped off. It was not well constructed. Let's put it that way.
Well, the good news is if you've got a crew that's their day job, and I think they have this, to walk those rails every day and inspect them and constantly do the maintenance on them, they can keep it going, but it's just not going to last 20, 30, 50 years. It's just not going to happen. Not like other, Western, similar type of construction projects built to Western standards would go. It's kind of like what they call in China the tofu construction. Okay. They're hesitant to put heavy supplies on that 2-lane bridge for the same reason you just mentioned earlier. They never really trusted it for anything more than just vehicular traffic.
Yeah,
okay?
It was never built for heavy equipment, and the reports that were critical of the bridge to begin with clearly pointed that out.
But it didn't need to be because you had the rail bridge.
Exactly.
But now they don't have the rail bridge. So consequently, now they need to get it across. And if one of those heavy loaded, say it's loaded up with artillery shells or something, and it's going across and the bridge collapses underneath it, now you don't have anything to move even the vehicular traffic. So there might be an ounce of caution right now. The supplies they're getting, they need them, and they don't need to take a chance with them. So they're using the ferry system. The ferry system is inadequate at best. It might be able to take care of them for a certain period of time in the defense. So what I really think they're trying to do right now in Crimea is along the Dnieper River is they're trying to build in standard Soviet era defense lines where you have troop trenches that go in a zigzag pattern, that have minefields, laid out in front of them, which have multiple lanes of multiple rows of concertina razor wire in front of them. You have support elements into your rear. You have interlinking fires. You have all this stuff that makes it, if you're going to attack, fine, you're going to either have to do some determined obstacle breaching and be prepared to take some serious attrition, because it's not going to be easy. And that's what they're trying to do, so that they can, and then behind that, another 10 kilometers behind that, do the whole thing again, but with feeling. So that they can do that and have minimal amounts of ammunition and have some kind of lanes set up so they can have a quick reaction force to send bodies to wherever the attack is, and they can get themselves into winter. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it to winter, because if they have enough, can get to winter, then maybe they can actually train some of those troops, because those guys that are coming up right now, they may have a gun in their hand, but they can barely shoot. The chances of them actually hitting what they're aiming at is...
Yeah, I've seen some of the training videos, and it's pretty pathetic.
And basically, the entire training system, even when the Soviets were up, every time that they would put on any kind of exercise or everything like that, they basically took their best equipment, they put it out there, and they rehearsed. They would have to rehearse before they could, in garrison, before they could get out there to the exercise, so they could make it look like they kind of know what they're doing. And the fact that they don't kill each other, and they do, every time they have an exercise, they always have multiple fatalities. The idea of getting out the side of that BTR in that little door between the tires is suicide. And the fact that they pride themselves that that door is there is mystifies me. I can't see that.
You mentioned once before that as they were coming in, they had their heads popped out. They weren't moving their turrets. They weren't getting the.
They couldn't move their turrets because they only had were drivers in those vehicles. Even the trucks only had a driver, no assistant driver. Okay, they didn't have gunners. They didn't have the reason why their towers weren't spinning. Their anti-aircraft systems weren't up and spinning because there's nobody in the back of it. Mm-hmm. They were just moving. They thought the war would end in 3 days. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now you're listening to the guy that said, I don't think anybody in their right mind would invade Ukraine because they don't have a logistics force to get past a few days. In a couple of weeks, they'll be bogged down and it'll look like World War I. And I was right, but I still lost the bet because I said they weren't going to invade.
Throw this in when Ukrainian armed forces went into Lyman, and it was a rout. I mean, the Russians just abandoned everything and just took with them whatever they could loot, killing civilians along the way. But it was interesting because when Ukrainian soldiers would go house by house and search buildings, most of the time they found Russian soldiers asleep on beds or on floors with an empty bottle of vodka next to them. And I've seen videos of conscripts in buses being transported, and every one of them is drunk, has a bottle of vodka. And I've seen a lot of video coming out of Russia like that.
Well, there's a lot of political science, arguments out there.
Oh yeah. It's a cultural thing. It's that's a whole story into itself. But I'm not surprised.
The Russian government looks at how they placate the people is by making sure there's cheap vodka. Mm-hmm. Because if you're drunk, you really just don't really care about an insurgency so much. But the bottom line is, there's an opportunity for Ukraine in the next 2 weeks before the rains really get going and the ground really starts muddying up. Okay. At this time, they need to attack and they need to get what they want to get done before winter, while right now the entire Crimea is going to be hurting for supplies. They're probably taking everything they can right now. Excuse me. Everything they can right now and moving it up to the front line to blunt any attack that comes from the Kherson direction. But that's not their problem. They'll take Kherson, and I think they'll stop at that point because they don't, not so much that they want to remove their forces and redirect them to another location, because I think they only have the forces excuse me, the forces that they had initially came in with, and they've only been replacing, those that are injured or killed, and to keeping them whole. They're not pushing massive amounts of forces into the Kherson area. They've already recognized that the Russians are leaving. All they have to do is continue to apply pressure, so they don't have to put more forces and commit them to that. I fully expect in the next few weeks, they will go for the true strategic plum, and that is cutting the land bridge all the way to the Black Sea in the center section, the Zaporizhia area. Now, they're going to have the Wagner guys to deal with, but Wagner's being bled. They've been constantly taking turf. It's incremental turf, and they've been losing it, and then they take it, and they lose it, and foolishly, they think that's not a big deal because that just fattens their coffers, because they're a PMC. They're being paid to take turf. If they put the conscripts or the relief Russian forces, or the forces that they've put into action, they've taken out of the conquered Donbass region, if they put them in there and they lose it, well, we don't care. We're Wagner. We'll take some more turf and get another check. Well, when I say we're Wagner, we don't care, I'm not talking about the guy on the ground. I'm talking about, the guys that run the company.
Yes. Okay.
And
the owner of whom is a close personal friend of Putin.
Yeah. Yevgeny, I think they pronounce his first name, Prigozhin, I think his name was. He's not just a close personal friend. He's so corrupt. He has so many, Wagner has so many Russian contracts. It's just not funny. Yeah. And he was a convict at one time during the Soviet era. So, I mean, he's got a real speckled past. But anyway, that said, the Wagnerians, I mean, they recently got in a firefight with the Russian troops because they were fighting over spoils of war. So they don't look at themselves as part of the army. Which to me, that creates an absolutely untenable situation, because you have an element on the ground that's not under your command and control, and might be able to say, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. So that can't be making the commanders on the ground very happy. But they're using them as the pointy end of the spear right now, and they don't have a whole lot of choice. Anyway, would back to your question on Putin, would he use a nuke? Well, first of all, both the former President Medvedev and Lavrov, the foreign minister they have right now, they tout, and I've heard, I think on a talk show once, Putin repeat it, Russia goes into this foreign policy of escalate to de-escalate. Okay. So, but in reality, the next step in escalation wouldn't necessarily have to be nuclear weapons. You can, and they've already tried it. They've tried to assassinate Zelensky on multiple times. They almost did it a couple times the first week of the war. But to take out their parliament, to kill high-ranking members of their military or their government, to include Zelensky, those might be incremental things that they have not been successful on yet, but could do possibly to escalate the situation. Just because Zelensky is got a backbone, whoever his replacement would be may not be so much. And right now, if we took out Putin, there's a lot of war hawks in his inner circle that could very well end up being even worse than Putin if they stepped up.
There are several that I know of, and he just recently appointed. I can't pronounce his name. His moniker is the Butcher of Syria. Has put him in charge
of the military.
Of the military
on the ground. Yes, I agree.
This guy's a nasty piece of work.
But see, the thing is, he was fighting terrorists, which have not had the training or the weapons supplied to them. And it's not just the weapons that are supplied to them. These guys are being trained by the best instructors in Europe and in NATO and US. They're getting basically one instructor to one individual. It's not like a class of 50 in front of one guy like we normally train our own people. But they're getting, hands-on. They're getting the tips, the tricks. They're not getting taught a lot of maintenance. I'm telling you that. Basically, if one of those HIMARS goes down, they pull up a tow truck and they take it back to Poland for NATO to fix. So, which is even better if you can just get the stuff retrograded back to the higher echelon maintenance. That's your big problem, because we're providing them the higher echelon maintenance. Russia just doesn't have any of these things.
That's what I was going to say. Russia doesn't have that capability.
They've got their main tank factory back up, and guess what model of tank they're building? The T-62. Because they don't have all the parts for everyone. The T-72, the T-80, the T-90. They don't have all the parts for them, because most of the parts they had for those vehicles that separated them from the T-62 were made in the West. And they don't have access to those parts anymore. That's why they can fix them now.
Even early on in the war, when Ukraine was even then capturing a lot of Russian armor and damaging that Russia was able to take back when they went into some of their holding facilities, with old equipment and tanks and whatever to go in and get parts. They realized they had already been cannibalized. There was nothing there to get, which goes into the whole story about the Russian military corruption. The money doesn't go where it was supposed to go, and
not just that. Every time and that's also some of the stuff that slows up the Ukrainian forces as they move forward. As they capture this equipment, they lose a man to drive it to the rear, because they can't, until it's fully inspected, you can't put it back into action. Because if you do, you're basically asking for another vehicle to break down, and they don't have the maintenance forces up front. They have basically user level maintenance that they're doing on these vehicles, and when one breaks, they have to take it to the higher level maintenance. So each vehicle they get from the Russians, they have to extract it, retrograde it back to some rear area location, and then go over it, inspect it, make sure it's not booby trapped, make sure it's fully functional, go over all the reactor armor, because the reactor armor they're finding doesn't have the explosive charges in them. So it's not going to do any good if you don't put the explosive charges in them. And it has to be the right explosive charge. So all of these things are having to complicate their supply chain, but we're training their people to be, we're training their army right now. We're training their supply guys to be supply guys. We're training their transport guys to be transport guys. We're training all their support forces to be support forces. You can use folks that have transferable civilian skills like doctors and nurses and stuff and put them in the mashes and throw a uniform on them. It doesn't really change, okay, except for who's paying them. But you can't really do that, even though you get a mechanic as mechanic. You're right, but it's a whole lot different working on a tracked vehicle than it is working on a truck. So you have to do some training from everything for their mechanics, for all the sport MOSs that are out there on the battlefield. But the thing is Russia was supposed to have a first-rate army. They were supposed to have all these things, and they're just complicating the problem right now, because putting all those conscripts that have no idea what they're doing, can barely tie their shoes. They're ill-equipped when they show up. They're ill-trained when they show up. And what few folks that you have that have a modicum of training are now having to spend some of their time training those guys just so they know how to handle the right wrench to them.
Mm-hmm. Or they're just giving up and surrendering, or just running away, which is it's happening a lot more than I think the general public realizes.
Well, there's YouTubes out there that show, stacks of, Russian uniforms as if they turned into, ghosts. In reality, they had stolen civilian clothes, and they changed into civilian clothes, and they've taken off. And they've taken some of their ill-gotten booty. They steal a car. They drive into Russia, and they just keep driving until they get into Belarus. And after they get into Belarus, they try to get into Western Europe somewhere. Or they take their vehicle and they put a white flag at the top of it, and they go forward and they hand their vehicle over, and they surrender to the Ukrainians, who put them in a cantonment area, feed them, clothe them, put a roof over their head for a certain period of time. There may be some videos they might have to make, and they pay them for the armored vehicles that they bring over to the Ukrainian side. That's a quick fix. You just can't do it in front of somebody, your own brother elements, that one or two of them may not be, in their mind, they want to surrender. So they may fire you up or fire up the Ukrainians that are trying to take your surrender. So you got to be careful on those type of things. But the video that I saw, they were very careful. They didn't send everybody out at one time. They only send one or two, but that one or two people, they're very vulnerable in that sense. But anyway, yeah, it's happening. It's an abysmal situation for the Russian army right now. Not only their army can't really fight like a first-rate army, they don't want to fight, period. So
exactly.
Makes a hard situation even more difficult. But let's say we go into winter and we go into some modicum of a ceasefire. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Right now, my money's on Macron. He's bucking for a peace prize. He'll try and say, hey, I'll broker him, or Erdogan of Turkey may try to get Putin and Zelensky to the table. I don't know if it'll happen or not. Zelensky's got a real, now that they're finding all these mass graves and stuff, Zelensky, him and his military have a real case of the ass. I don't think any of them would fault him for not going to the peace table.
Yeah, well, Zelensky has said that he will not negotiate with Putin, that they are in this to recapture everything that Russia has taken. And he's doing everything he possibly can do, with U.S. and NATO and other forces. And we've provided them with, massive amounts of weaponry, logistics, intelligence. I think that's one reason for so much of their pinpoint accuracy. We talked about, who's going to lose the attrition factor first, because the U.S. and NATO can keep them pretty much supplied, even though some production lines are going to have to ramp up or be re-ramped up or restarted. But Russia doesn't have that capability. And I see Russia failing at at being able to keep up with their attrition as opposed to the Ukrainian side.
Even though they may have 3 or 4 times the population of Ukraine. They do not have the numbers where they need them. The military age men are leaving as fast as they can. I don't think that people would tolerate a massive conscription of females. Russia has not been invaded like World War II. So everybody with a pitchfork isn't going to stand up and fight.
Mhm.
But that is the situation for Ukraine. And as well as you have people from foreign countries streaming in wanting to fight for Ukraine, which is probably most of your forces along the Belarusian border right now, because they don't really want a whole bunch of Western forces, volunteers to come in and get killed, and it's bad for the evening news. So they're kind of protecting some of the foreign legion that Ukraine has inherited now.
Mhm.
That said, Russia has already scraped the bottom of the barrel. There's open news reports where they're trying to buy arms and ammunition from North Korea. They're trying to get weapons and ammunition from China. Technically, whether Ukraine wins or Russia wins, definitely NATO and the U.S. wins, because Russia will not be able to recover from what's happened to it. Not before it falls apart based upon demographics.
Yeah.
It's a demographic time bomb that it was going to fall. They were never going to, if they didn't take all the historical attack routes into Russia in the next few years, they weren't going to have the population to do it ever. You got to remember, you're looking at Russia, who has the economy equal to Texas, okay, but 10 or 20 times the land mass, okay, and that much land mass puts a severe burden on the infrastructure that the government has to maintain. So trying to maintain imagine Texas trying to maintain the infrastructure of Russia and at the same time maintain a world-class military. They never have had one. They've always been a paper bear. There's several books that have been written by former Soviet officers that escaped Russia during the Cold War years and explained exactly how Russia cuts corners. Every single military base in Russia is a hazmat zone. If you're a commander of a unit of, let's say, battalion or brigade size, and this year you're given a whole bunch of gasoline, but you're not given any rounds for training. Okay, so you're going to falsify all of these training reports because you didn't have the rounds, okay? Or what do you do with the gasoline? Well, you sell what you can, but when they come back to inspect and dump, thousands of gallons in your tanks again on your base, you better have the capacity for it. So if you can't sell it on the black market, you dump it in the backyard somewhere on the base. Same way for ammunition. This year we didn't get enough fuel, so we couldn't conduct training the way we wanted to, but I have all this ammunition. Well, it's even harder to sell that unless you're selling it to a nation state. So what do you do with all that? Well, you get one of the engineering vehicles out, you dig a big hole in the ground, and you push all the rounds into that. So you have all of these military bases, and sometimes they would have explosions and accidents on these bases because this year's commander dug into 3 years ago's commander's ammunition, and it set one of the rounds off, and it caused a chain reaction and killed multiple people, and it was just kind of swept under the carpet. But it happens. And that's been going on for years. And those are the guys, those former Soviet officers are the ones that trained the Russian Republic that you have right now, military.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't get upgraded. They just got new uniforms. The T-90 is a barely upgraded T-80, and a T-80 is a barely upgraded T-72. And you still pretty much have the same chassis from a T-60 to a T-72. It's and the suspension system that the Russians had in World War II, they stole from us. I mean, everything is secondhand knockoff. Like I was telling you about the Russian mobile nukes they had. They don't, with good reason, they don't depend on getting the signal to launch from a radio, because they assumed those mobile launchers would be used after they had sustained a first strike.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably wouldn't have operable radios. So all of those pre-registered launch sites, they not only exist, they have them fenced off, and they have telephone systems, communication systems into the blockhouses at those locations. And that's how they control them. Somebody will be there to answer the phone when it's time to launch. It's pretty old school, but it works.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're going back to the T-62s that they're building in their tank factory. It's old school, but it works. And those weapon systems, okay, the ZSUs that they had out there, they're radar controlled. Okay, they fired smaller rounds, but they're close, ground air defense systems that you use to take out helicopters, use to take out low flying things like the A-10, but close air support systems and stuff. But there's not anybody in there aiming those things. They have a radar tracker built into it to use it. You're getting systems that don't have radar control for air defense. It's like the golden BB. You're hoping you're going to hit something by throwing up a lot of ammunition. And those weapon systems don't throw up a lot of ammunition. They were meant to shoot down low, slow flying, planes, not fast moving jet fighters or, or ground support aircraft. So anyway, I think more of that is for, and I think they're misled by the fact that they think that's comforting. If you're constantly supplying your troops with weapons, well, that's better than nothing, right? At least they're being supplied with weapons all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of these folks are young enough that they've seen enough Western movies and stuff that they recognize that these weapons aren't even near state of the art. They might as well hand them slingshots, bows, and arrows.
I'm concerned that if you're right, and Ukraine does take Kherson and other regions and does what I suspect that they're going to do, probably like you, do you think Putin would, or a commander who has authority, like on ships and submarines, they have independent authority from what I understand, pull the trigger on a couple of low yield nukes Of course, the ones we're talking about have maybe a 20, 30-mile radius. They're not strategic nukes that would take out an entire city. And they would probably have to use 3, 4, 5 in different areas because they're designed to take out, troop concentrations and armor concentrations. But the Ukrainians have been wise. They've kind of kept everything.
Well, not at the beginning of the war. They did a few concentrations, and they paid the price for it. From that point on, they've been pretty good about keeping their folks dispersed. But if you go back to the Soviet areas, and the Soviets, only strategic nukes were controlled in the Kremlin at that time.
Right.
Battlefield nukes, and they didn't call them tactical. Even we don't have a good definition of tactical. If you throw enough tactical nukes, it could be strategic. We kind of have the vague definition of it's bigger than Hiroshima. It might be used strategically, but usually tactical nukes are considered battlefield nukes. Those
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
used purely at military targets near the front line. Okay, with that in mind, they're supposed to be like 15 kiloton or less if we're thinking Hiroshima devices. And if they were to hit, let's say, to try and kill 3,000 or 4,000, and you could kill possibly 3,000 or 4,000 Ukrainian ground forces, but you'd probably kill 10,000 Ukrainian civilians in collateral damage because they are so dispersed. That would not change the war. They couldn't use just one. Let's say they just used 1 or 2 in Kherson. That might stop the advance. In order for it to do any good, you'd have to be close to the front line to get the concentrations that you want. But you're probably going to have a lot of collateral damage on your own people if you did. In order to get them, for the same reason, why did the Vietnamese get close to our front lines when we started bringing in the napalm? Because we would be hesitant to use napalm near the front line of their own troops, near the flot, because we'd want to take out our own guys. So that was the best way to do it. Get close to the enemy and stay close to the enemy until the enemy is dead. That would be not so good. And if they had any backbone in the Russian troops before that, they would probably run en masse at that point. But let's say we go back to your assessment of a battlefield commander but since the Cuban War, Cuban Missile Crisis, not war, but Cuban Missile Crisis, that was the first thing. Was it Kirchnev? Anyway, the premier of Russia at that time, Khrushchev.
Yeah, Nikita Khrushchev.
Khrushchev, he changed that. So whether you're on the battlefield or firing, got your button in a silo or a submarine, those commanders have to have an order. And now they do have a plan that they can fire without the order, but that's they have to have some assumption or reasonable belief that there's already been first strike in Moscow and the leadership is not available to give the order. But they're not supposed to initiate on that. Now, it's happened before in the past. Situations have come up on drop-off, and a Russian colonel put his career on the line and said, we're not going to launch, even though they had indications of a U.S. first launch. But he used his brain and said, if the Americans are going to attack us, they wouldn't attack us with one strategic nuke. They'd attack us with a few more, or they just setting themselves up to be taken in the face. And it turned out it was a faulty sensor that had seen some reflection off of a cloud, and they thought it was a launch. And he did the right decision, and we avoided World War III. But he lost his career, he lost his pension, and he was thrown out of the service in disgrace. But it's that sort of thing. It's happened in the past. I don't want to stake my life on it, but I do not think, for multiple reasons, that, and some of them are, just Pat's opinion here, that Putin would do it. First of all, he'd need more than one. To change the situation on the ground in Ukraine, he'd need a half a dozen to a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd have to scatter them right up and down the line. Okay? That would be the only thing that he could stop the Ukrainians. If he left any part of the battlefield open, the Ukrainians would shift all their forces in that direction, and they would attack the Russians, and they would probably lay their arms down as they attacked. So that wouldn't fix anything. So, and at the same time, they would have overwhelming response from NATO.
Yeah, that's something else I wanted to mention too, because the language that has been used by NATO and the Pentagon, well, the Pentagon's language was pretty, in our lingo, I read it a different way. Decisive, catastrophic response. Now, that tells
that doesn't say we're going to respond with nukes.
No, and I'm not saying that we will respond with nukes. What I think that they would do in that situation they would use classified programs, weapon systems, as well as all high explosive ordnance to take out their early warning, their air defense, which they don't seem to have much of. And they could use bunker busters on some ICBM silos. They probably would take out sub pens. I'm sure the Navy knows where all their subs are at, and they don't have that many really. Command and control. That's the kind of response I would see coming from NATO and the U.S. I didn't mean to imply that they would reply with nukes, but they could do decisive, catastrophic damage to Russia.
The last thing that
if they did respond with nukes, then you've got the escalation going on between both sides, and I don't think that NATO and the U.S. would take that chance to not know if he's already used a tactical, and they respond in kind. Well, you don't know what the hell he's going to do after that. So I see some sort of a conventional takeout of as much as they possibly can.
Well, let's diminish this right now, and you're going to see. Let's ask you a few questions, and you're going to see the obviousness of it. So you agree they're probably not going to use half a dozen or a dozen nukes along the battlefield to actually get the battlefield shaping goals that they want. Do you agree?
Probably, okay. Yeah.
So he probably won't go that far. All right. So now we're talking less than 6. Okay. 6 isn't going to get what he wants done. Okay. 1 is definitely not going to get it once done. So what would be the value of doing 1?
There wouldn't be.
Okay. So we've already gone all the way down. Well, the next thing they could, following the Lavrov principle of escalate to de-escalate, chemical weapons, biological weapons. Could we let that genie out of the bottle? Well, they did in Syria. They used chemical weapons on the folks in Syria, not biological, but they used chemical weapons. And that was a red line that the president of the United States at the time, Barack Obama, said, that's a red line. We won't cross it. We won't allow you to do that. We won't allow chemical weapons. They used them multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
We stood by. We did nothing. Now, that, in my mind, okay, you now have the vice president of Barack Obama in the White House. his intel staff might very well make the argument that Biden would do similar to what Obama did or didn't do. So that would be an escalation to de-escalate. Are you following me?
Mm-hmm.
That they could use and have been proven historically the U.S. did nothing. But I think if he did that, where the Soviets, where the Russians in Syria used chemical weapons, they used chemical weapons that dissipated quickly and did not leave a slimed battlefield for their guys to fight in.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for a chemical strike to be effective right now, and they don't work very good in the winter anyway because there's just too much water around to wash it away, they would probably do it while they still have relatively dry ground and dry air to put it out with. And they would probably use something that lasts a little bit longer, and they would fire it across the lines to the enemy far enough over that hopefully by the time the plume got anywhere near your folks, it would be dissipated, that it would not be effective. And you would have to mop up completely, meaning mop for, protective posture. But I don't think they have the enough kits and logistics set up to get the kits of the mop gear down to all of their own troops so they wouldn't have collateral damage. And if their own troops started getting slimed, I think they'd run. That would be the rumor. That would be like
I'm sure they would.
the Somme or half the battles of World War I. Once you had unprotected troops being gassed, they'd run.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be in my mind, that's where nobody's talking about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. But that, in my mind, would be something that would be worth arguing amongst the generals and the Politico in the Kremlin. Hey, we used them in Syria. America did nothing. Probably wouldn't do anything again. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
That's the only one I see that makes sense. All the others, I don't see them getting what they want, and they would wreak the ire of NATO and every one of their combined militaries all at once on all their fronts. It's bad juju for him to stay in power if he did that. So you got to keep going down the escalation, de-escalation staircase that Lavrov has created, and you got to find what would be an incremental step up that might push somebody to the table, because I know Lavrov is trying to get some way that he can have Putin save face, and getting them to the negotiating table so they can say, hey, we won all this, or these territories are now that we've taken are still ours, and they're part of Russia now. We won. Kind of like when Saddam said, I won after the first Gulf War, and everybody in America said, how did he win? Well, he argued to his people, I fought the most powerful country in the world. I'm still in power.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't argue with that. NATO can say, I fought all of NATO. Putin could say, I fought all of NATO, and I'm still in power. And all these are now our territories. They're part of Russia now. They're not independent countries, breakaway republics from Ukraine. They're ours. And the Nazis didn't beat us because they said the whole reason they're going into Ukraine was because they want to defeat the Nazis. I do not think he would commit suicide. I think he always thinks he can come out on top. So even Saddam Hussein did not commit suicide when his whole country collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
He went into hiding, and even when they found him in hiding in his little rat hole, the first thing he said, "Hey, we can negotiate." So I'm just telling you, these guys, even though they're the most arrogant, most narcissistic guys that walk the face of the earth, you put them in the corner, they're probably going to want to negotiate rather than commit suicide by death by, cop, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Wave an empty gun at the enemy so they could put one between their eyes. I just don't see him doing that. And he's fighting another war right now because he has his hawks in his inner circle that say he's not doing enough. With those guys in place, if he had listened to them, we would probably already be at a nuclear engagement state.
Mm-hmm.
So he is pushing those guys back, even though he may agree with them. He knows the consequences of going a step too far. So I just don't see him doing that. Everything he's done right now seems to be going along the Lavrov escalate to de-escalate. He responded to the explosion of the bridge at Kerch by hitting all these not necessarily indiscriminate. He was hitting a lot of power centers because he's trying to separate the NATO from support from Ukraine, because Ukraine was sending electric power into Europe, selling it into the grid into Europe, because they have several other nuclear power stations. Ukraine hasn't shut down all their nuclear power stations to make the greenies happy. Okay. And Germany is really regretting that they've shut down so many of them. They're bringing some of them back online and not letting others go offline because they know they're going to need that power in the winter, in spite of whatever Greta Thunberg happens to say. But right now, just like when they shut off the gas into Hungary, and Hungary walked out of the EU and took back their people that were sitting in the EU Congress, got up and left because they said, we did not agree to send arms into, and they're not part of NATO, but we did not agree to send arms to Ukraine. Okay. And I thought the EU had to have a unanimous consent to do this. So obviously you're not following your own rules. So we're leaving. Okay. So they've already got up. Now they may come back to the EU at some time, but that really made, Putin and Lavrov very happy, because obviously it was a mechanism that drove a wedge in between EU partners. They're wanting to do the same thing. That's why they shut down Nord Stream 2. They're talking about giving them a little bit of the gas back now, turning it back on, which means they must have a plan to, fix those lines. And it's not that much trouble to fix them. Okay. They're only broken in, or very close to each other in the, one place. It was more to scare, Sweden and Norway, and I think the line that goes between them and Holland. But the bottom line is, if we had tried to take out Nord Stream 2, we would have taken out the lane ships along with it, because we wouldn't have given them a way to fix it. But they obviously did it so they wouldn't have to have the excuse of, this compressor broke down, and the only reason why we're not sending you gas right now is because we're doing maintenance trying to fix this compressor. And there was supposed to be a compressor that was being fixed in Canada. Canada got a special dispensation to fix that compressor and fly it into Russia, and they did. Now they needed another excuse not to send gas, blowing up the line and blaming everybody else. They thought they could cause dissension amongst, the EU and NATO. It didn't work, but Hungary did work. Taking the gas away from Hungary, they had no real other way that they could see of getting energy. They walked out of the EU. Not that whatever Hungary could bring to the table with arms or support really made that big a difference, but it did cause the solid front of the EU to to waver some, okay? And they thought Nord Stream being shut down would make Germany, waver. It hasn't yet, thank goodness. But they think it's just one more thing. It's like folks that believe in Keynesian economics. When it fails, well, it's because we didn't go hard enough. We didn't go far enough. We didn't spend enough to get our way out of this. So that's kind of what I think they're doing. I think what Lavrov thinks. I don't think they want to go all the way to the top of the staircase of escalation, but I think they want to exercise a few more steps to see what that gets them. So I would think they would probably try things like, high-level assassinations, or taking out other key infrastructure, taking out the energy systems that are pushing power into Europe from Ukraine. It will cause some pain, but I don't think it'll cause enough. They're going to try. I look for accidents to happen inside of Europe at maybe a nuke plant, or maybe a power plant. I expect if that's KGB's type of stuff, now FSB's type of stuff, that's sort of stuff that I'm sure Putin is aware of and is expecting it to be done. One of the reasons why the Crimea, the pincer movement that came out of the Crimea that took, all the way up into Kherson, and they had so many, and the land bridge itself in the early days of the war where they had the successes, was because the FSB had gone in advance, paid people off. Those bridges were, rigged to explode. They never went off when the Russians invaded, back in February, because they had already plowed the way in advance. They had caches of supplies in the basements of various buildings. When the Ukrainians, were clearing areas, and they would go from the bottom of the building to the top. They'd find all these supplies, and they'd find some Ukrainian that had been living there, and it was his job to take his little truck and load up stuff over months in that area to have forward, deployed caches of supplies for the Russian army. So the FSB was planning this invasion for over a year before it happened. So I would expect that there is some plan, whether it's an old Soviet plan that they have to dust off, or a new FSB plan. They have plans for, sabotage of U.S. and NATO countries.
We've been an hour and a half. What do you see in 6 months from now?
A very good chance the Ukrainians will have taken the land bridge, broken it at the very minimum, taken all of Kherson, taken all of the land along the Black Sea that faces Crimea. Very good chance they have taken Crimea also. However, I don't think before could be they're planning for an invasion, not invasion, but a counter attack into the Luhansk and Donbass area in 6 months. And they're trying to push the last of the Russians out of their territory. I could see that being very likely. If it has not happened, there's probably a good chance that Putin's still in charge. Because if Putin's not in charge, I don't see any reason why any Russian soldier would stay in the Donbass. They would just turn around and go home. And
what about if one of Putin's inner hawks takes over?
Then we'll still be fighting. If Putin or one of his more hardline inner circle is in charge, they'll still be fighting. The Russians will still have a foothold in the Donbass. But as that line continues to shrink, it's easier for the Ukrainians to attack, but it's also easier for the Russians to defend because you don't have as much territory that you have to defend, and it's easier to build your defense in depth. When you have a long line to defend, it's hard to defend it in the first place, and it's very hard to defend it in depth because it's such a long line.
Well,
But
Pat,
what else I can do for you?
you've done it. You've done it. You've given me a pretty good, clear, definitive explanation from you that I was looking for.
Yeah. Look for them to take opportunities to escalate, to de-escalate, things that just make it a little bit hotter. Hopefully things that are focused at separating the EU or NATO partners. That will be the things that they will try to do because they don't have the capability to win on the battlefield. They're just like I'm saying, this war will be finished, resolved one way or another off the battlefield. It could be resolved in the EU Parliament, and they voting not to supply the Ukrainians anymore, just as easily as the Kremlin could take out Putin, or one hardliner could take charge, or maybe just the people rise up because they're getting tired of their kids being conscripted and killed. All right, you have a good one, sir.
Pat,
enjoyed it.
You too. Thanks so much.
Plug my book here. Here we go.
Oh, yes.
Taking intelligence analysis to the next level.
We'll put a link to it in the description below.
All right, you take care.
Pat, thanks so much.
All
Another
right.
episode of Homeland Security Off the Record. We've got more coming up. We'll see you the next time.
All right, take care.
Take care.